This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 1.2, Part B. We're picking up exactly where we left off. We had just discussed the War of the Grand Alliance, or known as King William's War. This is going to be the second of the Imperial Wars, known as the War of the Spanish Succession. In North America, this will be referred to as Queen Anne's War. It will be equally kind of non-conclusive in North America. And the cause of this, again, without getting into any great length of European politics, this will be Louis XIV's second attempt at gaining hegemony in Europe, and it will again deal with the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. As I mentioned previously, the Habsburgs, by the end of the 17th century, certainly, and really the end of the 16th century, had become inbred. Charles II rises to the throne of Spain, and he is infirm, He's sickly from the very get-go. He has a very weak immune system, and among other things, he's virtually sterile. There is actually no evidence to history that he's not sterile. He dies without an heir of any kind. Now, it's actually not true. He does prove that he's not sterile because he does have a couple of daughters, The problem is that under the current conditions of succession in the Habsburg dynasty, women are not permitted to serve on the throne. It has to be a male heir. It's based on primogeniture of male heirs, firstborn male heir. He has no male heirs. So when he dies, there is no succession to the Spanish throne. And so it's up for grabs. And actually, probably the strongest claim to it is from Louis XIV. Louis XIV's grandson is the product of a marriage between Louis's son and one of Charles's daughters. And so Louis's grandson, Louis feels anyways, is the logical successor to the throne of Spain. However, the cousins in Austria disagree with this, as do the English, as do the German princes, because the last thing in the world you want to see is the Bourbon dynasty of France also control Spain, which gives them also a claim, anyways, to Austria. And at this point, the Habsburgs also control Mantua, Genoa, and have a claim to the throne in Naples as well, in southern Italy. So this would make by far Louis the dominant player in Europe. This would gain his hegemony if he was able to press this issue. And so they're going to oppose him. This will be in North America known as Queen Anne's War, which will be the high point of piracy in the Caribbean. After Queen Anne's War, the European powers get together, and in a little better than 2 decades, they wipe out piracy in the Caribbean because it's bad for business. Piracy is bad for business. Up to this point, piracy in the Caribbean serves their purposes. It serves their purposes by everybody praying. In fact, prior to this point, prior really to Queen Anne's War, you don't really have piracy in the sense of piracy. What you have is you have brigands. You have independent actors serving different European powers, as mercenary forces to prey on the shipping of their opponents. After Queen Anne's War, you're going to have legitimate piracy. No loyalty to any of the European powers, and as a result, they're going to be wiped out very quickly. But at any rate, the British will this time capture Nova Scotia and keep it from the French. The Grand Settlement is the most operative part we want to look at, and the Grand Settlement in 1701 will establish from this point forward Iroquois neutrality. No longer will the Iroquois be given to side with either France or England. It will be understood that they're a neutral player in this in North America. And the contest, the game, will then be played between only the European powers. And that neutrality will last until King George's War. This will be settled with really what caused. I say the Treaty of Utrecht here. It's really the treaties. It's a series of negotiated settlements in Europe, in the city of Utrecht, which is in Holland, which will establish, among other things, the balance of power system in Europe as the main operating system. It will be recognized as the operating system, that it is in everyone's interest for no one player to become the dominant player of the game. This will be the final defeat of Louis's attempt at gaining hegemony. And that's the War of the Spanish Succession. Louis fails, by the way. Okay. Actually, Louis succeeds temporarily in getting his grandson on the throne, but it's only temporary. Now, as for the War of the Austrian Succession, at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, to try to clear this up, because the Habsburgs are still in desperate trouble in Spain, they still have no male line of succession. The male line of the Habsburgs is dying out. Okay? So, in an attempt to stabilize the process of succession to the Habsburg throne, Charles issues the Pragmatic Sanction in 1713. The Pragmatic Sanction says that primogeniture, okay, is the main method of succession in the Habsburg dynasties, both in Austria and in Spain. First, the throne would pass to the eldest, the firstborn male heir. If there is no male heir, it would then pass to the second-born male heir, third-born male heir, fourth-born male heir of the direct descendants of Charles. But if he does not have a male heir, then it passes to the firstborn female heir, meaning that females can rule as empresses. Okay, this is not a popular idea among the European powers. Okay, this will be opposed by most. Okay, this will, among other things, war will break out in 1744. Upon the death of the emperor, based on the Pragmatic Sanction, the Austrian throne, not the Spanish throne, but the Austrian throne, will be given over to Maria Theresa, his eldest daughter, okay, from that line. This will be opposed. Now, among other things, this will see the birth of Prussia as a major European power through the charisma, strength, and military adeptness of one person, Frederick the Great. And if you're a student of military, it's a little bit tangential for our purposes here, but if you're a student of military history, I heartily encourage you to study the campaigns of Frederick the Great in this war specifically, but in other wars as well. Frederick is truly one of the brilliant military commanders of history. He will, in all cases, oppose forces that are much larger than he is, and in virtually every case win out, because he is truly a tactical wizard, and he will prove that in this war. And yes, to some degree, he will oppose the Pragmatic Sanction of Maria Theresa, but in reality, it really has nothing to do with the line of succession. Frederick uses opposition to Maria Theresa and the Pragmatic Sanction as an opportunity. Frederick is, if nothing else, opportunistic, and he will use this as an opportunity for Prussia to seize territory that they claim, okay, principally in Silesia, okay, in what is now Western Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. Okay, when Maria Theresa ascends the throne in 44, Frederick will immediately move into Silesia and lay siege to Prague and take it. He will immediately be opposed by both Austria and Britain. France will then side with Prussia, and will have the next major European conflict. In North America, this is referred to as King George's War. Among other things, it will end Iroquois neutrality. The Iroquois will side with the French, okay, which will be one of the principal reasons the French will maintain their holdings in the North American continent. France is now, see, as I mentioned, the War of the Spanish Succession, Queen Anne's War in North America, was Louis's second attempt at hegemony. The problem with it is that between the two of them, between the War of the Grand Alliance and the War of the Spanish Succession, it virtually bankrupts France. Okay, France is now teetering on economic collapse, as Spain was, 100 years earlier, 50 years earlier. Well, now France is in that position. It will end Iroquois neutrality. What we mean by that is that the Iroquois will side with the French. And the war is, again, relatively inconclusive in North America. However, it will, the substantive conclusion with it will be the Treaty of Lancaster, signed in 1744. And this will become one of, in fact, probably the main precipitory cause of the French and Indian War in North America. Now, the French and Indian War will have as its antecedent the 7 Years' War, which will be the product of continued rivalry between Prussia and Austria after the War of the Austrian Succession. But in North America, it will be known as King George's War, or the French and Indian War. And one of the precipitory causes will be a dissonance or a disagreement in the interpretation of the Treaty of Lancaster. The way the Treaty of Lancaster reads is that the Iroquois and the French cede trading rights, okay, to the forks of the Ohio River, which is to say Pittsburgh, okay? We're talking about with the forks of the Ohio River. We're talking about the confluence of the Allegheny River and the Monongahela River. This is going to be why at least the first phase of the French and Indian War takes place in western Pennsylvania, okay? Well, there's a problem with this treaty. Its interpretation is different. The French and the Iroquois interpret this that the forks of the Ohio River, okay, the British are now allowed to trade there in that geographic region. That does not give them control or cede the territory to England. The British disagree. They see this treaty as ceding western Pennsylvania to the British, okay? Which actually, technically speaking, the treaty does not say. That is not what the treaty says. The British will interpret it that way in an effort to be able to exploit that to push the French from western Pennsylvania. That brings us to the 7 Years' War. In Europe, the 7 Years' War is the product of continued Austrian and Prussian rivalry. And again, it will be Frederick the Great. So if you really want to continue your study of military history and study of Frederick the Great, this is another wonderful demonstration of Frederick's tactical mastery of 18th century warfare. In North America, this will be the French and Indian War. Among other things, what this is going to see now, we'll deal with this character, and then we'll deal with him later on again as we deal with the American Revolution. We start to see George Washington. Now, a brief biographical study of George Washington. George Washington desperately wanted to be seen as an equal to the British commanders of the British regular army. What Washington desperately wanted was a commission in the British regular army. He did not get that. He will never get that. He is a colonial commander. And what we want to understand here, and this kind of underscores it, and it's going to be one of the underlying contexts for the revolution. By the middle of the 18th century, the English colonists in America are seen as country bumpkins. They're not considered real Englishmen. They're not the kind of Englishmen that you would find on the streets of London. They're common, okay? Even the aristocracy among them, even the wealthy among them, is seen as a lesser class British citizen. Washington among them. This will also be true of Alexander Hamilton. It will be true of John Adams and Samuel Adams and John Hancock and all those great patriots of the American Revolution. They're all kind of seen as country bumpkins by the British. This will be true of Washington. Okay? Now, early on in the French and Indian War, in order to press their claim to the forks of the Ohio, the British are going to send a regular army commander by the name of Braddock. with a small force to seize Fort Duquesne, okay, which is at the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers, giving Britain control over western Pennsylvania. In support of this operation, okay, and to establish a logistical supply line, a colonial commander by the name of George Washington is given command of a small force that is comprised both of American colonists and some members from the Iroquois Confederacy, okay, primarily colonists, but among them will be one of Washington's erstwhile allies, for whom the city of Monaca is named, Manakatootha, okay. All right. Washington is given a very simple task. He is tasked. Braddock is now going to march up and attempt to seize Fort Duquesne at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Okay, Washington is supposed to support the southern advance to Fort Duquesne, and what he's supposed to do is create a logistical and communications supply line by finding a way of fording both the Youghiogheny River and the Monongahela River. And Washington will fumble around, literally fumble around, for the better part of 3 months in the area now where, if any of you have ever been there, Ohiopyle. Okay, this is the area that Washington is reconnoitering. Okay, and he'll bumble around in the Laurel Highlands for the better part of 3 months. He will never successfully find any way to cross either the Youghiogheny or the Monongahela River. Instead, by fumbling around the way he does, he makes it possible for the French, a small force of French, and mostly a larger force of Iroquois, to gather sufficient forces to pin him. They eventually pin Washington, and this is the very famous Fort Necessity. Washington places himself, bizarrely enough, okay, with the entire Laurel Highlands to maneuver around in. He somehow fumbles around and manages to position himself between the Monongahela River, the Youghiogheny River, and a larger force of Iroquois and British. And so he's pinned. No means of escape. And so he rapidly builds, and if you've ever been there, this ramshackle fortification known as Fort Necessity in a last-ditch effort to resist the Iroquois. And he is unsuccessful. They crush his tiny force. Okay? He ultimately negotiates a ransom and is freed. But it is the first of what will be many defeats for George Washington. And it demonstrates to the British why it is that they're not going to give George Washington a legitimate commission in the British Army. Okay? And during the Revolution, what we're going to see demonstrated over and over is that the British will just simply say to themselves over and over and over, you know, we were right never to give this bonehead a commission. Because it's just going to be one disaster after another. We'll deal with that when we get to the Revolution. One of the more substantive things that's going to take place during the French and Indian War for the colonists is the First Albany Plan of Union. We talked about the Albany Conference, which is where the New England colonies principally coordinated their action and took Port Royal in Nova Scotia. This is going to be different altogether. This time is the first time that the colonists get together and begin to discuss a unification of the colonies. Okay? And that's one of the things that we want to underscore in our mind is prior to this point, it was never even considered that the colonies were one unified thing. We always talk about them as the 13 colonies and the colonies, but in reality, they're each considered their own independent sovereign actors. This is the first time that it's going to be discussed that they actually unify together. And as I've said, the war largely revolves around control of the Ohio Valley. We now deal with phase 1 of the war. General Braddock, okay, supported very poorly by George Washington in the South, will march up and attempt to take Fort Duquesne. which he will fail to do in his first attempt, and he will be killed. Okay, he's actually killed in a battle right near what is modern day Kennywood down in West Mifflin, and General Braddock is actually buried under that road somewhere. Nobody knows where, and the reason nobody knows where is because the natives had a habit. It was believed by the natives that if you ate the heart of a defeated opponent, you would capture part of their spirit. Part of their spirit would enter into you. And so to prevent the desecration of Braddock's body, they bury him in an unmarked grave. Now, in the first phase, the French and the Indians are very successful in both preventing the British from gaining a foothold in western Pennsylvania and by reversing a lot of the British territory and turning it back over to France. And the reason that they're able to do this is because the French adopt the tactics of the Native Americans, which is to say guerrilla tactics. Okay, and so they'll launch a series of hit and run operations to disrupt logistical and communication support by the British, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the British to maintain an offensive. In phase 2 of the war, it's a complete reversal of fortunes for the French. William Pitt will rise as the British Secretary of State, and his mark on history, for which Pittsburgh will be ultimately named. We want to remember here that the French and Indian War, this North American theater of operations, is a lesser theater in the conflict. Okay, it's a sideshow. The main conflict is the 7 Years' War in Europe. Okay, that's where their main attention was. That was true of King George's War, which was the War of the Austrian Succession. That was true of Queen Anne's War, which was the War of the Spanish Succession. That was true of the War of the Grand Alliance. The North American theater was a sideshow. Okay, it wasn't really taken very seriously by anyone. William Pitt's going to change that. He convinces Parliament in England to commit more resources to the pursuit of the war in North America, on the thinking that if successful, it could drive the French out of North America altogether and deprive them of that resource base. Parliament buys this argument. Okay, Parliament buys this argument. And so under Pitt's direction, greater resources are committed to the North American campaign, and the British, see, one of the things is that the French and Indian War, it's kind of strange. It's not the case that the Iroquois Confederacy sided with the French and the British fought them alone. The British also had Indian allies, Manakatootha among them. Okay, there was a kind of it almost brought to a civil war the Iroquois nation itself, the Iroquois Confederacy itself. Okay, what's going to reverse the fortunes of the French is that their ground forces are going to come under the command of a guy by the name of Montcalm. Montcalm believes that the unconventional guerrilla tactics of their native allies are dishonorable. We remember at this time what European warfare is like. European warfare is the most bizarre, inane type of warfare ever. The idea is that you stand upright with your rifle in hand, except for the guys in the front line. Those poor bastards in the front line, they don't even have a rifle. They have a flag or a drum. Okay, and you march at the enemy's line. The enemy at that time is launching volley after volley, okay, at you and cutting you to ribbons. This is European warfare. This is why the casualties are so high. Okay, this is considered honorable. Guerrilla warfare was a hit-and-run tactic. Essentially, you wait behind a tree with an axe in your hand. You wait for the enemy to pass by that tree. Then you jump out, take him by surprise, and cut his head off. Okay? That sounds like a much better way. I like that plan better. That seems like that preserves my survival a little bit better. Montcalm believed that was dishonorable. And one of the things we learn is from Sun Tzu and from Clausewitz is honor schmonor. What matters is victory. This is friggin' war. By definition, in war, there is no such thing as honor. Okay, this is about murder. This is about killing. Okay, but at any rate, we digress. Okay, so Montcalm comes in, and so the French are going to adopt an entirely different strategic and tactical approach to the war. And from the beginning of Montcalm's command, the French will begin to suffer a series of disastrous defeats. They will ultimately be driven all the way back to their stronghold at Quebec. Okay, and that brings us to the second largest to this day, the second largest battle on the North American continent, the largest being Gettysburg. This would be the second largest battle on the North American continent. At the time, the largest. And we'll go over it in a little bit more detail, but James Wolfe will be the overall commander of British forces, and Montcalm the overall commander of French forces. And you see the forces now. It's a little bit unfair, I suppose, to the French to say that they outnumbered the British 2-1. They did outnumber the British 2-1, but in terms of French regular forces, like actual trained French forces, the French really only had about 4,500. The remainder of the force were natives, okay, what the French referred to as aboriginals. They were natives and poorly trained militia. The British, for their part, had about 4,500 regulars. So they were, in terms of the regular armies, the actual trained armies, they were about even on the Plains of Abraham. The French had a lot more allies among the native population. And so they actually outnumbered the British. Now, and I have in the next slide, I have a map that I'll show to go over this in great detail. The basic plan was this, and it was really kind of funny because I remember some years back when I was a kid, we went on a tour up to Quebec and saw the Plains of Abraham, and there was a tour guide, giving his analysis of the fortifications and of the battle, and the guy talked in French for 15 or 20 minutes, and one of the guys that was with us was the British, and in point of fact, the battle lasted about 15 minutes, and then the French surrendered, and the reason was because of Wolfe's tactical approach, which was nothing short of brilliant. What Montcalm, okay, and we'll look at this. You know what? In fact, I'm gonna go to that slide right now so I can explain this, and then you can go back and look at this slide or have it next to you in the printed out PowerPoint to go over the narrative of it. Okay, here's Quebec, the fortified city. Montcalm was convinced that what was going to happen is the British were going to come here, this way. He was convinced this area here, okay, is all cliffs, okay, high mountains, like you see some much higher actually, that you see on the banks of the Ohio River here, much higher. This actually was about 150 feet high, okay, so sheer cliff, 150 feet high, with one tiny little break here at Cont'd. Montcalm was convinced that the British would come here with their fleet and attempt here an amphibious assault on the fortress itself, in which case the French artillery could just annihilate the British fleet and annihilate the British forces that landed. So he had all of his forces positioned, expecting an amphibious assault here. Wolfe outmaneuvers him. Wolfe sends what at that time is one of his adjutant commanders, a guy by the name of William Howe. William Howe will ultimately become overall British commander of British ground forces in the beginning stages of the American Revolution. Okay, he will be succeeded by Clinton after the Battle of New York. Okay, well, William Howe is given the task of taking the 5,000 men and literally landing here and through Cont'd, scaling a 150-foot cliff to take up a position on the Plains of Abraham. They do this, and if you've ever tried to scale a cliff, this is an absolutely unbelievable undertaking that Howe was able to do this. Wolfe planned it. Wolfe was the one that came up with the idea. Howe was the one that actually tactically executed it. And it's absolutely unbelievable that he was able to execute it. Okay? You're talking a 150-foot cliff. And he scales it with 5,000 men. And he does it in the middle of the night. Okay? And so in the middle of the night, William Howe lands here, scales this cliff, and in the morning, at sunrise, just prior to sunrise actually, establishes a position on the Plains of Abraham, which is this area outside of Quebec City. This surprises the French completely. Montcalm is told of this, and he simply can't believe it. He's like, yeah, you're full of crap. There's absolutely no way that the British could possibly have done that. What he anticipated maybe was that they would seek to come further on and land here and then have to cross the St. Charles River, which would be impossible. Okay, for them to have scaled this cliff is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous undertaking. Montcalm couldn't believe it. They showed him. They said, look, right out there, buddy. See them? Them's guys in the red, them's British guys. Them's aren't our guys. And Montcalm couldn't believe it, and so he hastily, as quickly as he possibly could, assembled as much of his army as he possibly could get together, and literally he had 10 minutes to assemble them, and marched them out to face the British on the Plains of Abraham. An utterly idiotic idea. Rather than waiting for French reinforcements, okay, to arrive from Beauport, okay, in which case he could have had another 5,000 men, 3,000 of whom would have been regular. And then it would have been a different contest altogether. But Montcalm moves prematurely. He has no artillery support because all of his artillery is trained on the St. Lawrence. The British have managed to bring up a little bit of artillery here, okay, and the Grenadiers lay behind this. And the assault lasts very little. The French are so taken by surprise that they attempt a few volleys and to march on the British position, but by this time the British, which are almost entirely regular troops, create a series of cascading volleys against the French, driving them back into Quebec, and Montcalm has no choice but to surrender the city. Early in the battle, in the initial French assault, General Wolfe himself, who is in overall command, positioned here, is shot 3 times and dies. When the British counter-assault, Montcalm will be mortally wounded and will die the next day, and his adjutant commander will surrender Quebec City, which surrenders the French position on the St. Lawrence, and by doing effectively ends the French on the North American mainland, in Canada. Anyways, they'll maintain control over Louisiana. I should say in Canada, it will end the French control over Canada. The results of the battles of the Plains of Abraham, the Battle of Quebec, is an overwhelming French defeat. Now, the second point, the Iroquois changing sides. We should mention this because the Iroquois really were quite adept diplomatically, but they're really running out of room diplomatically now. From the beginning, what maintained the Iroquois territory and what preserved their confederacy for the longest time was they would play one off the other. Okay, so they would play the French off the British, and that was a very successful strategy. That's what led to Iroquois neutrality after Queen Anne's War. Okay. That's now going to become an increasingly difficult position to play for them because the French are now gone. Okay? You see here that in the Treaty of Paris of February 1763, the French will maintain control of their possessions in the West Indies, Martinique, Montserrat, and Guadeloupe. They will cede all of their territory east of the Mississippi River, which is to say mostly Canada, but also parts of northern Michigan and northern New York, to the British. They will maintain the Louisiana territory, which ultimately Napoleon Bonaparte will sell to the Americans under Thomas Jefferson. We'll deal with that when we get there. France will also, now remember that the French and Indian War is antecedent to the 7 Years' War in Europe, and the Spanish, British, and Austrians are against France and Prussia. And so if the French defeat in North America, the Spanish will negotiate certain territorial concessions for themselves, most notably France will maintain or rather, Spain will get the western part of Louisiana and the port of New Orleans, more importantly, which is control over the Mississippi River. Which is why Louisiana, my stepdaughter in the U.S. Air Force, who is now stationed at Monstrum Air Force Base in Montana, was for years and years based at Barksdale Air Force Base. And Louisiana is a really interesting part of the United States. In fact, it's the only part of the United States that's like this. Louisiana is the junction of three different cultures. In the western part of Louisiana, you have Spanish culture. And in the eastern part, you have a combination of French and English culture. And so it's one of the more interesting melting pots of North America, or of the United States. But at any rate, after 1760, when the French fortunes are done in the eastern part of North America, the Iroquois will change and side with the British. The legacy of the imperial wars. The principal difficulty that we're going to deal with, that the British have to deal with, is after 4 major wars and 7 decades of conflict, the United Kingdom is in debt in excess approximately £150 million. Okay? In an effort to finance this debt, they are going to introduce, for the first time in history, taxes on the colonies. Prior to this, the colonies did not pay any tax whatsoever to the British Empire. Okay? They do this, one, to help finance the war debt, the swamping war debt, and two, because from this point forward, the French are still in possession of the western part of North America. They still own west of the Mississippi. The British will now need to maintain, between the French and the Iroquois, they will need to maintain a permanent force on North America. Okay, this will come from the Proclamation Act, which we'll deal with when we deal with the prelude to the Revolution. Okay, well, that's going to cost money, and they're going to try to get the American colonists to foot some of this bill. Okay, this will be another of the examples that we'll deal with in 1.3 of the ever-increasing attempts by Great Britain, by the English, to exert greater control over the colonies. The second part of this is that this is the end of France for the most part in North America. They will maintain control over the area west of the Mississippi, but they're actually not able to project force there. Okay, this is the final death knell, really, of the Bourbon Empire, and the French Revolution itself is 20 years away. 25 years away. So the British will now dominate North America. And as I mentioned to you, this is going to cost the Iroquois greatly because they will now lose their flexibility. For years and years, they've been playing the French off the British. Now, they'll be able, 20 years from now, when the American Revolution takes place, they'll be able to play the Americans off the British. But once the British are thrown out, then they'll lose that. So their maneuverability, okay, their latitude for maneuverability diplomatically is rapidly going away. There will be a brief war. We talk briefly. These are some of the other wars that go commensurately with the 7 Years' Wars, the Cherokee War, and Pontiac's Rebellion, which will take place immediately following the Treaty of Paris. Okay, because the Pontiac Indians, which are in Ohio, realize what the collapse of the French position east of the Mississippi means for them. It means they now have no cat's paw to keep the British at bay. They can't play the French off the British. And so Pontiac will rebel immediately because the British, to explain the Treaty of Paris, the British are ceded territorial control of all French possessions east of the Mississippi. A lot of that is Indian territory. Pontiac will object to this and will lead a rebellion against the Americans. This will be one of the first and most famous uses of biological warfare against the Indian populations. What the English British will do is, in an effort to negotiate with Pontiac, they will provide blankets and other items to the Indians that are infested with smallpox, for which the British have a vaccine. And as a result of that, the native populations will die of smallpox. It'll be the deliberate use of biological warfare. It means the territorial expansion of Great Britain into Canada, into the northern part of Florida, which will still be owned by Spain until the early part of the 19th century. East of the Mississippi will be the remnants of New France, and ultimately, what all of this will conclude with is this will place an ever-increasing strain on Great Britain's ability to project force and to maintain logistical control over this new territory. Okay, they literally outstrip their ability to maintain control over the territory. Okay, and it will be an ever-increasing strain on their resources, for which they will ultimately attempt anyways to get the colonies to pay for some of it. And this will lead to a very negative reaction on the part of the colonies, beginning with the Stamp Act. It actually begins with the Proclamation Act, which we'll deal with later on, which we'll deal with in the next PowerPoint, actually. And that concludes the discussion of international relations and brings us up to the 1760s. In the next PowerPoint, we'll deal with the prelude to the Revolution, which will deal with some of this that we've talked about just by way of reference, and Britain's increasing attempts to control the colonies. But this concludes PowerPoint 1.2b.